Hi, my name is Ron Kirkwood. I'm the author of this book here, Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals in the Battle of Gettysburg. And I flew out to Milwaukee today from Pennsylvania to have the high honor of speaking at the Wisconsin Club to the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. And we're going to talk tonight about the two hospitals on this farm and why I think this farm was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. And if you want to learn about it, the book is available in hardcover, paperback, and audio and Kindle. Thank you very much.
Speaker is Ron Kirkwood. He's talking about George Spangler Farm Hospitals. It's based on his book, which is over there. And again, he has those for sale. It's called Too Much for Human Endurance, and then there's a subtitle, but I didn't have room on the card. He argues that the George Spangler Farm was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. After a 40-year career, Ron is a retired writer and editor for various newspapers and magazines. He's a Michigander, native anyway, and he is a graduate of Central Michigan University. And Donna would have me read this or I'll be in big trouble. His book, Too Much for Human Endurance, is the winner of the third annual Savas-Beatty's Sweet 16 Tournament of Books. So, Ron.
Thank you. This is a high honor to be in this facility with this prestigious club. Try something. Okay. All right, now I am not a Packers fan. Let me establish that right now. You can boo me even more when I tell you that I'm a fan of the Detroit Lions. No, you shouldn't boo. You should give me sympathy for that. But my wife, big Packers fan.
That's why you married her.
Yeah, she's a lot smarter than I am. We live in Pennsylvania. My next door neighbor, who is from New Jersey, is a Packers fan. My son-in-law, who lives in Virginia, is a Packers fan. And his mom, who lives in Utah, is a Packers fan. So your guys' tales are all over the country. Barb and I have lived in Pennsylvania for 38 years, but we grew up in Southwest Michigan, and we return home often. And so 3 years ago, she wanted to tour Lambeau. So we did, and it's a beautiful, beautiful stadium. And I have your coach up there because Barb and I met at Central Michigan, which is in Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is where he grew up. His dad, Denny LaFleur, was on the CMU football team when I was a student there. And when I was writing for the student newspaper, I actually covered Denny LaFleur. So I kind of like Matt. Better than Aaron Rodgers. But it's nice to have the connection. But enough about me. Let's talk about Gettysburg. I argue in my book, Too Much for Human Endurance, that George and Elizabeth Spangler owned the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. So we'll look at that first. Then we'll discuss the two major hospitals that were on the Spangler property. We'll talk about the Spanglers themselves. We'll talk about the last 3 days of Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Armistead's life, which he spent at Spangler. And we're going to mix in a few things on the 26th Wisconsin, because this was their hospital. This was their core hospital once they got out of the hospital downtown after the Confederates retreated. So you can see in gray on the map, this is the farm, and there's the Union line. This farm was huge. It was 166 acres. It dominates the countryside behind the line, and as you can tell, it's close to the left flank down at the Round Tops. It's close to the center of the line, and it's close to the right flank of the line at Culp's Hill. And try to keep in mind, especially this distance down to the round tops, because I'm going to talk about that more. You've got the roads, Granite Schoolhouse Lane cutting through the middle of the farm in green, Blacksmith Shop Road cutting through with the yellow X's. They connect the Tawnytown Road and the Baltimore Pike, the two main arteries. With the Spangler Farm, Union commanders were able to hold massive amounts. They had the size, location, and roads needed to hold massive amounts of infantry and artillery in reserve and get those reserves to the line quickly and often just in time. This was the farm that could help win a battle. That's the Spangler Farm, and that's how it was used by the Army of the Potomac. Number 9 on the map is the Artillery Reserve, which I'm going to get to in a minute. Number 4 is the Granite Schoolhouse. That's the site of the second hospital on the Spangler's farm. Most followers, and I would say all of you who follow Gettysburg at all, know all about Gettysburg, know the story of the 20th Maine, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, how those 5th Corps regiments got to Little Round Top and the area around it just in time. But what you might not know is they got there so quickly because they spent the afternoon of July 2nd right here with the Round Tops down here. So about 5 o'clock, the 5th Corps, they got the orders, get to the front. Part of the 5th Corps goes down Granite Schoolhouse Lane. The other part of the 5th Corps goes down Blacksmith Shop Road, and they both arrive at the Round Tops. They're not gone long, then the 6th Corps arrives over here, and they don't stay there long before they take off down Granite Schoolhouse Lane to the front. Later that night, a division of the 12th Corps leaves Culp's Hill, which is up here, and they cut in through Granite Schoolhouse Lane. George Meade has his main street, and it's named Granite Schoolhouse Lane. Now you have the 11th Corps Hospital here, which I'm going to talk about. The ambulances attached to it are here and here, 100 ambulances. If they're not here, they're at East Cemetery Hill. More infantry artillery bivouacs. You've probably all heard of Powers Hill, but again, you might not know that Powers Hill was mainly owned by the Spanglers. Infantry up there, artillery up there. Slocum sets his 12th Corps headquarters up there on July 5th, 1st, and he's up there through the 5th at the top and the bottom of the hill. Then you have General Meade, bombed out of his house along the Tawnytown Road out of his headquarters. He retreats on the afternoon of July 3rd. He joins Slocum up on Powers Hill. Battle over, he returns to the line. Later the night of July 3rd, he returns to Spangler Land, sets up his headquarters right here. And if you've been to Gettysburg, there's a Slocum headquarters marker there. But his headquarters was on the George Spangler farm. Finally, on July 4th, the thunderstorms that moved in, he had to leave, and they had to move inside. The photo shows one artillery battery. There were 19 artillery reserve light batteries crowding and overflowing George Spangler second, about 2 o'clock. Each of the 7 Union Infantry Corps at Gettysburg had their own artillery batteries, totaling about 200 cannons among the 7 corps. These cannons went where their assigned corps went. The artillery reserve, though, they added 106 cannons, 2,300 men, and 2,300 horses, another whole third of power. Plus, the artillery reserve cannons based at Spangler on July 2nd and 3rd, they could be plugged into the line wherever they were needed. They didn't have to follow their infantry corps. They were crucial utility players, and that's how Meade and Artillery Chief Hunt used them on the 2nd and 3rd. They rushed cannons from Spangler to the line with only moments to spare to prevent a Confederate breakthrough. So artillery reserve batteries rushed out from Spangler. They fought here on the Charleston farm along the Wheatfield Road. They fought all along Cemetery Ridge. They fought at Cadore. They fought at Cemetery Hill. They fought at East Cemetery Hill. And there were even artillery reserve batteries on the Spangler's own Powers Hill. These are 9th Massachusetts horses, 9th Massachusetts Battery. These are famous images that were combined. About 2 hours before they were killed, they were at Spangler, along with the 2,000 other horses that were there. If they had broken our lines, all would have been lost, and sometimes they came so very near. But our generals were watchful, and whenever our lines were closely pressed, wherever they were giving way, there, just before the critical moment arrived, we would see the serried ranks of the reserve march up and reinforce our lines and drive the rebels back. Captain Frederick Winkler, 26th Wisconsin. Almost all of those artillery and infantry reserves pointed out by Captain Winkler came from the George Spangler farm. Other farms saw a lot more combat than the George Spangler farm at Gettysburg. Some were literally destroyed by this combat. No single farm, though, played a greater strategic and logistical role with its 2 roads, with Powers Hill and its in the middle of it all location, than the George Spangler farm in setting up the Army of the Potomac's victory in the biggest battle of the Civil War. Now the hospitals. The Granite Schoolhouse Hospital in the middle of the Spangler's farm. The 1st Division caught the heaviest of the blow. Many killed and wounded were the result, and the latter were now being brought to the hospital in great numbers. Granite Schoolhouse Hospital surgeon in charge, Dr. William Warren Potter, 57th New York. Granite Schoolhouse was built in the early 1860s when the Spanglers donated the land in the middle of their farm for it. On days 2 and 3 of the battle, there was a major 1st Division 2nd Corps Army of the Potomac Hospital in the fields and woods around this school. This hospital has received little attention since the battle, and little has been revealed about it until my book came out, and I think that's a shame. It's just ignored, overgrown, unmarked land, now with thorns and poison ivy that make it difficult to enter, as shown in the bottom left photo on the page. This hospital hosted the 1st Division 2nd Corps, wounded and dying men who fought at Rose Woods and the Wheatfield, 2 of the most well-known places on the battlefield. These were the fighters of the famous Fighting Irish Brigade. This was the division of Father William Corby, who gave the men general absolution moments before they went into battle, thus clearing their path to heaven, future president of Notre Dame. This was the corps of General Winfield Scott Hancock. More than 1,000 men of the 1st Division were casualties on just that one day of fighting. And by the end of July 2nd, most of those wounded were either at the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse on the George Spangler farm, or they were waiting to be taken there. Chaplain John Henry Wilbrand Stuckenberg of Erie and the 145th Pennsylvania served at the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital. He said, "Our hospital was at the foot of Powers Hill. I found the doctors and nurses busily engaged with the wounded, scattered around in all directions, some lying on blankets, some on straw, a few on stretchers, others on the bare ground. Private Erastus Allen of Company G, shot through the abdomen, suffered terribly. Some of the intestines protruded through the wound, and some of their contents would occasionally flow out, producing a horrible stench. It was very evident that our regiment had again suffered severely." Second Corps Ambulance Chief, Lieutenant Thomas Livermore of New Hampshire, made numerous deliveries to Granite Schoolhouse on July 2nd. He said, "Here under the shelter of some boulders lay a large number of our wounded and dead who had been brought from the field. They lay upon the ground covered with their blankets, and the living were nearly all silent, having fallen asleep from fatigue." Brigadier General Samuel K. Zook, treated at the schoolhouse on July 2nd for a massive chest wound before dying in a house farther behind the line on July 3rd. His wound was so huge that it opened a hole in his chest that allowed the doctor to just look in and see his heart beating. The monument on Wheatfield Road at the top left, many of you have probably seen it. For those of you who've been to Gettysburg, marks where General Zook, where mortally was wounded. It's on the north side of the Wheatfield. Colonel Edward Cross, 5th New Hampshire, died July 2nd at Granite Schoolhouse after being mortally wounded on the opposite side of the Wheatfield from where General Zook was mortally wounded. Cross Avenue between Devil's Den and the Wheatfield bears his name today. Colonel Cross was beloved as a great fighter in New Hampshire and by many of his men, but he was despised by others for his drinking and tantrums. His unit's pioneer corps called him a tyrant, and they refused to bury him. The monument in the middle of the page is to Cross and his fighters. Lieutenant George A. Woodruff, 1st United States Artillery Battery I, was mortally wounded on July 3rd during Pickett's charge when he was hit in the back while facing and directing his men in Ziegler's Grove. The son of a Michigan judge died at Granite Schoolhouse, telling his friends that he regretted being shot in the back and asking that it be no reflection upon his reputation. Most of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse was moved to safety farther behind the line on day 3 after 24 hours of intense service because it was getting hit by Confederate artillery overshots from the pre-Pickett's charge cannonade. The school was torn down exactly 100 years ago in 1921, and nothing remains of it except the foundation of the building, which is buried under decades of growth. This fallen tree accidentally marks the site of the school. The open fields where the wounded and dying men of the Wheatfield fight lay next to the school are now covered in woods and overgrowth. And there are no signs indicating what happened here, as there are for other division hospitals all around Gettysburg. And I'm told very recently by the National Park Service that they do have no plans to clean up, mark, and honor this location. This is why I decided to write a book, the 11th Corps Hospital. Everything I've talked about tonight up until now, I found out later after I didn't really know about it. I found it out later during my research. This is why I started to write the book, This Hospital. One day cured me of a hospital. Give me the picket line every time in place of a hospital. Captain Matthew B. Cheney, 154th New York, after visiting the 11th Corps Hospital. The 11th Corps medical staffers picked the Spangler's farm for a hospital, first because of its proximity to the evolving front line and access to water, access to crops and livestock for food, buildings for hospital purposes, good roads, wood for operating tables, tents, fires, and caskets. While the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital used the school on Spangler land, the 11th Corps Hospital used the Spangler's barn, their summer kitchen, their house, other outbuildings, and fields. Now, George Spangler was 47 years old during the battle, and his wife Elizabeth was 44. Their children, all of whom were living at home during the battle, were Harriet, who was 21, Sabina, 19, Daniel, 17, and Benaiah, 14. The 6 Spanglers were ordered to leave by the 11th Corps doctors when they arrived on July 1st. Somehow the Spanglers talked them into letting them stay, but the deal was all 6 of them had to stay out of the way in one upstairs bedroom in a house that was going to be full of wounded officers, wounded and dying officers, in a bedroom with no screens, with a chamber pot, with insects, and with southern Pennsylvania heat and humidity in July. They could leave the room, but they had to step over dying and wounded Union officers just to get out. So the ambulance corps started delivering the 11th Corps and other wounded to Spangler at about 4 o'clock on July 1st. at the hospital's peak attendance on July 4th and 5th, the Sanitary and Christian Commissions estimated that there were about 1,900 wounded men at this hospital, with between 50 and 75 Confederates among those 1,900. Dr. Daniel G. Brinton of Westchester, Pennsylvania said, "The wounded soon began to pour in, giving us such sufficient occupation that from the 1st of July till the afternoon of the 5th, I was not absent from the hospital more than once, and then but for an hour or two. Very hard work it was too, and little sleep fell to our share. 4 operating tables were going night and day. Many of them were hurt in the most shocking manner by shells. My experience at Chancellorsville was nothing compared to this, and I never wish to see such another sight. For myself, I think I never was more exhausted." Surgeries and amputations took place here under the forebay, the overhang of the Spangler's barn. There, doctors could have more light and fresh air away from the smells and the crowds inside the barn. Surgeons worked here with their backs against the wall. A surgeon could finish an amputation, depending upon the limb, in 5 to 15 minutes, and then move immediately to the next one. No washing required of bloody or germ-infested hands or bloody equipment, because they didn't understand how proper sanitation could prevent infection and reduce the spread of disease. A Spangler surgeon approaching total exhaustion called the work too much for human endurance. Private William Southerton, age 19, 75th Ohio, said, "At the doorway, I saw a huge stack of amputated arms and legs, a stack as high as my head. The most horrible thing I ever saw in my life. I wish I had never seen it. I sickened." The amputations and surgeries and wounds attracted an infestation of flies that relentlessly harassed everyone. Pigeons in the barn added to the filth, and hornets added to the pain. Then there were the maggots that covered wounds and stumps. Infections were expected after a Civil War surgery, and the worst infections could be smelled 8 to 10 feet away. So imagine the stench that greeted a hospital staffer or visitor in the barn, or when entering a tent filled with 8 to 10 men all suffering with infections. To help battle these smells, Spangler hospital workers cut branches off of pine trees, and they hung them on the tents, and they used them inside for bedding. The Spanglers had a classic Pennsylvania bank barn. I don't know if there are any of those around. Are there any around here? With the forebay in the front and the bank up in the back? Okay, well, this style was brought over by the Amish and the Germans in the 1700s and the 1800s. I'm actually surprised with the strong German heritage of this area. There are? Okay. Well, their home base is south central Pennsylvania. That's where the most are, all across the southern part of the state, and it extends into Maryland, Ohio, and Virginia. And I think they're brilliant. The forebay on the front allows for more working space, more storage space on top. The bank in the back, you just drive your wagon right up for easy loading and unloading. I think it's genius. And I think these barns are beautiful. I think they're works of art. But men were crammed so closely together in the Spangler's barn that it caused the spread of diseases. Some men died of the diseases that they picked up in the barn rather than the battle wound that brought them there. All of this hospital was horrific. All of this barn was horrific. But it was the worst under the forebay, where the amputations took place, and just inside that front wall in the stable. That's where many of the worst cases awaited their surgery, amid cries of agony, smells of infection, body fluids, and human feces. Cries and screams could be heard 50 yards away in the Spangler's house. Hospital workers covered their head with a pillow at night to try to drown out the sounds. Nurses read scripture and prayed with the men in an attempt to help send them on their way. Outside in the Spangler fields, the Army didn't provide enough tents or bedding or food or clothes for the first several days, multiplying the misery of the wounded and dying men who were forced to lie in the mud in the open when the thunderstorms came. Corporal William R. Kiefer, a hospital worker from the 153rd Pennsylvania, which was from the Allentown area, he said hundreds were lying with but feeble, or in most cases with no shelter, exposed to a cold, incessant rain against the sides of the barn and in an orchard adjoining the sheds. Their moans were heard in every direction, and with a lantern I moved about from one to another during the long hours of the night. I searched in vain for blankets to cover the suffering and dying. Two female nurses played key roles at Spangler. Marilla Hovey and her 17-year-old son Frank traveled with her husband, Dr. Bleecker Lansing Hovey of the 136th New York, and she was always one of the first to reach the hospital during a battle. Sadly, no photos of Mrs. Hovey are known to exist today. The Hoveys are the only surgeon's family, the only one known to have traveled together during the Civil War. Mrs. Hovey nursed the wounded and wrote home to family members of the dead and dying. She was able to go into sort of an autopilot mode and look past their terrible wounds and suffering and hold the hands of the dying soldiers and talk to them in a desperate attempt to get their mind off their agony and their situation. In one letter from Spangler, Mrs. Hovey informed a family of their son's death and told them, "I have had a good deal of care of him and called him my soldier boy, and tried to take the place of mother, sister, and friend. I think I never had such a trial, parting with one that I had no more acquaintance with." The Hoveys worked at the 11th Corps Hospital the entire 5 weeks it was open, then went home to New York for 3 weeks to recover. Pictured is Nurse Rebecca Lane Pennypacker Price. She was from Phoenixville, which is outside of Philadelphia. She rode to Gettysburg on a bench in a railroad cattle car in the middle of the night with donations shortly after the battle. Then she went to work as an unpaid nurse at Spangler. She said the sad scenes would fill a volume. So many times at night I lay on my stretcher weeping instead of sleeping. Captain Augustus Vinyos, 107th Ohio, was wounded on July 1st on what is now Barlow Knoll. Gangrene developed and his right arm was amputated above the elbow at Spangler. Mrs. Price nursed him from near death until he was well enough to take a train home to Canton, Ohio. He went on to marry in 1866, have 9 children, many grandchildren, while amassing substantial wealth as a businessman. He was even a pallbearer at the funeral of close President William McKinley. Vinyos literally carried Mrs. Price's photo for 40 years after the war. He showed the photo to fellow ex-soldiers at national encampments in an attempt to find her and thank her, but without luck in those 40 years. Finally, in 1906, he received a letter. "Dear sir, do you remember the tall nurse at Gettysburg who furnished you with clothing so that you could go home? She had found him." Vinyos replied that he looked forward to seeing her with great pleasure, and their reunion took place at a GAR encampment in New York State in 1906, 43 years after they met at the Spangler's farm. Here's my wife, Barb, again. We spent a week several years ago up at Cornell University. A lawyer was going to write a book about the 154th New York, and he never did, but he had 40 boxes of research. And we didn't know, Cornell didn't know, which boxes had the research that I was interested in, because the 154th had doctors and patients at Spangler. We went through 19 boxes. Took us a week. Filthy boxes. We were just covered in 1800s dirt and paper at the end of each day, and I think it actually might have even caused me to get asthma, but it was worth it. Not only did we get information on those guys, but those guys were there when General Armistead arrived at the farm on July 3rd, and they wrote about it, and they talked about it. And because we toughed it out in that dust and dirt, I got a lot of brand new information on General Armistead that I could put in my chapter on him. So I will always be grateful that. Plus, those boxes were in such bad shape that Cornell has now closed them, and you can only get at them now unless you're wearing a hazardous materials suit. So, new information coming up on General Armistead. Armistead began the final walk of his life in what would become known as Pickett's Charge on the Seminary Ridge farm of Henry Spangler. He would die 2 days later on the farm of Henry's half-brother, George Spangler. Armistead arrived at George and Elizabeth's farm at dusk on July 3rd, 1863, according to Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York. Armistead arrived at George's farm in an ambulance. He was removed on a stretcher and placed on the ground next to the ambulance near the Spangler's barn. The 11th Corps Hospital workers, Private Emery Sweetland and Private Edson Ames, 154th New York, excuse me, described Armistead's appearance as pretty bloody and covered with blood. Sweetland heard Armistead as he lay on a stretcher say, "You have a man here that is not afraid to die." The Spangler's property at that time was a shoulder-to-shoulder mass of chaos, agony, and crying when Armistead arrived. Many wounded from Pickett's Charge were pouring in as overwhelmed surgeons desperately tried to find who could be saved with immediate attention. Even so, the arrival of the Confederate general turned heads, and a large crowd of workers and gawkers formed around his stretcher, circling Armistead. The crowd was eventually broken up when the 154th, Dr. Henry Van Arnhem, arrived at Armistead's side and ordered that he be carried away for treatment. Fellow Spangler patient, First Lieutenant T.C. Holland, 28th Virginia, said he and Armistead were placed in the orchard. Lieutenant Holland said at one point under the trees that Armistead asked the doctors and nurses working around him to, "Please don't step so close to me." Dr. Van Arnhem described Armistead as wild, nervous, flighty, saying, "War must cease, men of same blood," and he could not live. Spangler patient Private Justice Silliman, 17th Connecticut, described the 46-year-old Armistead as rather past middle age. Private Sweetland said Armistead had gray hair and whiskers. Dr. J. Kling, 55th Ohio, said Armistead was suffering intense pain induced by the wound. Stimulants and painkillers were immediately given him. Dr. Brinton took time to get to know Armistead, calling him a fine man, intelligent and refined. I had considerable conversation with him and was much pleased with his manners and language. Armistead died July 5th in the summer kitchen. That's that separate building to the right of the house. Army of the Potomac Captain Frederick Stowe, the son of anti-slavery author Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, was Armistead's roommate in the building, which was reserved for VIPs. Stowe lived. Armistead was wrapped in a blanket and placed in a coffin made of wood from the Spangler's farm and buried in their orchard. 1 month later, he was exhumed by an embalmer from Philadelphia who was seeking to make money off of his body. So Armistead was dug up after a month in a wood coffin. His body was embalmed in whatever condition it was in and then reburied. His body was dug up one more time in October when relatives claimed him and reburied him in Baltimore, or downtown Baltimore. I have found, confirmed, and listed the names, wound, and treatment of 1,436 Union and Confederate men at the Spangler 11th Corps Hospital, and the names of almost 140 men who were buried here in the Spangler's peach and apple orchard. The Union men were exhumed within a few months after the battle and reburied in Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, where President Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. It wasn't so pretty for the Confederates, other than for Armistead, they lay in Gettysburg until 1872, when they were exhumed and reburied across the South. Armistead is one of 5 known Confederates to have been buried at Spangler. 50-year-old Colonel Eliakim Sherrill of the 126th New York died in the Spangler's house. His funeral in Geneva drew lines of people that stretched several blocks. His image is on the monument to the 126th New York in Ziegler's Grove. Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore of the 61st Ohio died at Spangler. Amazingly, he was the only Army of the Potomac surgeon or assistant surgeon to die at Gettysburg. He left behind a 1-year-old child and a 2-year-old child and a young widow named Sarah, who was so torn by grief that she mourned for the rest of her life and never remarried. Colonel Francis Mahler of the 75th Pennsylvania out of Philadelphia died in the Spangler's house. The Philadelphia City Council honored him with a resolution and paid for his funeral. His brother, 2nd Lieutenant Lewis Mahler, died on the battlefield on July 1st at about the time and place of his brother's mortal wounding. Records at the National Archives that I saw, the National Archives and Records Administration in D.C., show that 2nd Lieutenant Charles Bruckert, does that sound right? Bruckert, 26th Wisconsin, was treated at Spangler. He suffered a compound fracture in his lower right leg in fighting on July 1st, had part of his leg amputated, and he died there July 16th at age 31. Private George Nixon of the 73rd Ohio died at Spangler. He would be the great-grandfather of President Richard M. Nixon. George Nixon was 40 years old when he entered the Army as a poor man working on a rented farm. He left behind a wife and 9 children when he went off to war, very likely only enlisting to make money to support his family. And I think his eyes tell the whole story, if you can see his sad eyes in his enlistment photo. He was making a sacrifice for his family. Adjutant and First Lieutenant Joseph Heaney, age 21, 157th New York, died of a leg wound at Spangler. Nurse Price walked next to his stretcher and held an umbrella over him to protect him from the July sun as he was taken to the Spangler barn for an amputation. First Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler, 75th Ohio, age 25, spent almost a month at Spangler before he died of 4 wounds. His parents were at his side, and Nurse Price sang Rock of Ages to him as he died. Private Franz Benda of the 26th Wisconsin was one of the last wounded men to be taken from the Spangler 11th Corps Hospital when he was transferred to Camp Letterman on August 6th, on the day that the Spangler Hospital closed. He died August 28th at Letterman at age 19 of what the doctors called exhaustion. And he is buried in Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg. Many soldiers didn't always tell the whole story of the seriousness of their wounds in their letters home from Spangler because they didn't want their family to worry. Sergeant Henry Seas of the 82nd Ohio wrote to his brother, "My leg was amputated just above the knee. I stood the operation very well, being under the influence of chloroform. I am very well cared for and in a fair way to get along well. I hope Mother will not worry herself about me." But he died 1 week after he wrote that letter. Many died at Spangler as teenagers. 19-year-old drummer Thaddeus Reynolds of the 154th New York, it was in such agony from lockjaw as he neared death that doctors put him under with chloroform so he could die in peace. Corporal Andrew Mayberry of the 20th Maine died at Spangler, leaving behind wife Hannah and 5 children ages 6 months to 11 years. One father arrived at Spangler one day after his son died. One wife arrived a few days after her husband's death. They found out about their loved one's death when they arrived at Gettysburg. But the vast majority, by far the vast majority, of 11th Corps hospital patients survived, thanks to Civil War medicine, as rough as it might have been. Captain Alfred E. Lee of the 82nd Ohio went home from Spangler with a hip wound, and he found his obituary in the newspaper. And right after reading the obituary, he walked right in on his funeral. Brigadier General Francis Barlow spent a week at Spangler with 3 wounds that numerous doctors declared to be mortal, but he surprised all of them and lived. It is thought that his wife Arabella attended him at Spangler. Corporal James Brownlee of the 134th New York survived 7 gunshot wounds at the Brickyard on July 1st, one of which broke 4 ribs. He was shot 3 times through the bowels and survived somehow. Here's a local guy for you folks. Captain Francis Lackner, 26th Wisconsin. Spent a week at Spangler with a wound in his right calf. He said of the scene there, "We lay for several days among the dead and wounded while the surgeons were operating and amputating. He received a leave and went home, where he wrote, 'As I limped through East Water Street in Milwaukee, I saw a crowd of people before a newspaper office, reading and discussing the lists of dead and wounded, my own name on the list. The crowd followed me to the nearby St. Charles Hotel, where I held a little reception, but unfortunately could not answer all the questions of the anxious fathers and mothers as to the fate of their sons.'" You know, I know the hotel is torn down, but I walked from my hotel today because I wanted to see where that was at City Hall Square. Where is that in relation to the City Hall that sits there? Which side of it? Do you know, anybody? Well, it was on the square somewhere, right around where City Hall is, that hotel, St. Francis. Lieutenant Colonel Hans Boble of the 26th Wisconsin had his right leg amputated above the knee and spent time in the Spangler's house with other wounded officers. Both Boble and Lackner were wounded on July 1st on Barlow Knoll, but they weren't picked up and taken to Spangler until July 4th after the Confederates retreated. Also like Lackner, Boble survived and went home. If you combine the number of wounded at Granite Schoolhouse with the number of wounded at the 11th Corps Hospital, then the Spanglers hosted almost 3,000 wounded and dying men on their farm, more than the entire 2,400 population of Gettysburg at the time. The surgeons at Spangler, I think, were among the best of the best for their time, and they saved far more lives than they lost. And just like the soldiers, these surgeons were taken prisoner, they were wounded, they got sick, and they suffered. Many Spangler surgeons died in their 30s and 40s because of their exposure to disease, their horrifying work, poor food, long marches, and unsanitary camp life. I dug up in my book, researched the names of 15 head surgeons who worked at the 11th Corps Hospital, and most of them went on to leadership roles in medicine and their community after the war. These are 3 of my many favorites. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York was a passionate opponent of slavery who wanted full civil rights for blacks. Excuse me. He said, "The curse of God visits on all that come in contact with this atrocious institution." Dr. Van Arnhem served 4 terms as a United States Congressman. Unknown to Dr. Van Arnhem, his nephew and namesake, 22-year-old Captain Henry Van Arnhem Fuller of the 64th New York, was killed July 2nd in Rose Woods at Gettysburg while Dr. Van Arnhem worked nearby at Spangler. Dr. Van Arnhem constantly told his wife in letters home how much he missed her and how much he loved her. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry K. Neff of the 153rd Pennsylvania was captured in Chancellorsville and held prisoner for 4 weeks, and his health never recovered. He was sick with pneumonia as he cared for others at Spangler, and he remained sick after he was transferred to work at Camp Letterman later in July. He died not long after the war at age 45. Spangler surgeon Dr. J. Kling of the 55th Ohio was captured by Confederate cavalry while on his way home and imprisoned for 3 months after being mustered out in Georgia. He wasn't in the Army anymore in 1864. He filed a claim to the government for losses sustained and expenses incurred, but was denied because he was taken prisoner after he was mustered out. They did more remodeling since I took this photo. This house is totally redone. It extends back there, and it's now offices up here and a very modern, fancy conference center on the first floor. Finally, on August 7th, the Spanglers got their farm back after 5 weeks and 2 days of bloody occupation. At least they got back what was left of their farm. George filed 3 damage claims to the state and federal governments, totaling about $5,000, but the Spanglers received only $90. And it's believed that the entire $90 went to their Washington, D.C. attorney, so they got nothing. The U.S. quartermaster's agent, in denying their claims, said, "The government of the United States is no more responsible for bringing on the battle fought there than it would have been had a tornado passed over that country, causing as widespread destruction as did that terrible engagement. That battle and hospital damage was his misfortune." But that was common. Gettysburg citizens even gathered a committee because they were being denied so much on their claims. You know, how can we get our money? How can we be repaid? And a tiny, tiny fraction of the residents were ever repaid. The often used top left photo is one of only 3 known photos of members of the George Spangler immediate family. And this was of their youngest son, Benaiah, his wife, Sarah, and their daughter, Mary Elizabeth. This photo probably for the 25-year anniversary of the battle. George and Elizabeth had bought a small farm next door and moved away by then, and Benaiah and family were running and working the farm and living there. You can see that the Spanglers rebuilt well. Their house in 1863 during the battle was that big. And so even though all the kids had moved away, they added all that. This was their smokehouse. You know, you don't have refrigeration or electricity, so they salted and smoked their meat and hung it on hooks, and that preserved their meat. Their outhouse. Picket fences were normal back then around farmyards, lawns. Again, that's their summer kitchen with the grape arbor. They grew grapes on it, and they also sat under it for the shade. The Spanglers did not have a kitchen in their house. They just used the summer kitchen for heat purposes, kept the heat out of the house and for safety. And the Germans liked to put the buildings between the sheds between the house and the barn, so they're lined up there. Top right photo, I was thrilled to recently find that photo. It's of their number 3 child, Daniel, and his wife, Effie, taken on their wedding day in 1892. So now I have photos of Benaiah and Daniel, but I still need their sisters and their parents. The photo at the bottom right is in front of Granite Schoolhouse, and that was taken in the mid-'80s. You can see Benaiah looking like he's under the green X, looking like he walked off the movie set of Fiddler on the Roof. He's in the photo because he was on the township school board, just like his father was president of the school board. His grandfather, Abraham, of Spangler Spring fame, was president of the local school board. Daniel was a teacher in Kansas for a while. Sabina's child, Annie, was a teacher, so the education was big in the Spangler family. This is where Mary Elizabeth attended school on her grandfather's farm, just a 1/4 mile walk from the house. Mary Elizabeth is marked by the yellow star. Clara Patterson is under the arrow, and Alice Patterson is under the oval. They are the daughter of George and Elizabeth's second child, Sabina. Teacher Maggie Swartz is on the right, I don't know if you can see it, but she's holding a ruler. In the front, with his dog, that's little Raphael Sherfy. The Sherfys owned the famous peach orchard of the battle. Now, by the time this photo was taken, Raphael's father had already died, but it didn't seem to hold him back because he went on to be a prominent dentist in Gettysburg. George Spangler was chairman of the Cumberland Township School Board when he donated the land for Granite Schoolhouse in 1861. He also was a church and Adams County leader, serving on several boards, including the Evergreen Cemetery Board that voted not to allow Confederate burials there. A teacher whom George hired said, "Mr. Spangler proved himself to be a very efficient school official and made a lasting impression on my mind as a man of truthfulness and honesty in all things." Elizabeth Spangler took care of her widower father in his later years and made sure he was buried next to her and George. The Spanglers also took in a niece after George's sister Susanna died. All four Spangler children became productive adults. Harriet and Sabina married local farmers and worked hard and had families. Daniel moved to Kansas to use his carpentry skills in the growing new state and settled near Abilene around the time that Wild Bill Hickok was marshal there in the early 1870s. Benaiah worked the family farm for many years until he gave up farming and moved into Gettysburg in about 1890. As was common in family in those days, personal tragedy followed the Spanglers. George's daughter Harriet died 2 months after he died. Then Harriet's daughter Annie died a few days after her mother. So Elizabeth lost her husband, a daughter, and a granddaughter in a little more than 2 months. One of Daniel's 2 sons drowned in Kansas, and Benaiah's only grandchild died as a toddler. That's what it looked like when the foundation bought the farm. After an almost complete rebuild since purchasing the property in 2008, the Gettysburg Foundation now opens the farm to visitors and offers programs and tours on weekends in June, July, and the first half of August, including this year even with the virus. Please note that if you can visit, that most of the wood inside that rebuilt barn was there in 1863 and is the same wood that the men lay on and next to. Some of that barn's wood even dates to a log cabin barn that was built on the property in the 1700s. The Spanglers recycled that 1700s wood when building this barn. I hope you can see this. This is my final slide. This is the 26th Wisconsin from Milwaukee. I have a list in the back of my book of the 1,400 wounded and dead men who were treated at this hospital. And the 26th Wisconsin had the most wounded at this farm out of 50-some regiments and batteries represented there. And despite that being horrifyingly sad, it's actually amazing too, because most of the 26th Wisconsin guys did not even get to this farm till July 4th. They were trapped in town behind Confederate lines. And then once the Confederates retreated, the 11th Corps ambulances go out and bring them in. So they had 135, the most wounded at the George Spangler farm. And that's it. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'll leave this slide up here. Mm-hmm.
We have questions? Yep.
From your research, how big is that barn and what kind of animals or storage was in there before the battle?
The Pennsylvania bank barns, I don't know the exact dimensions. It was like 70-something long by 40-something wide. He got horses in there. He got hogs in there. He got sheep in there. He got chickens in there. Can't really see it because I blocked it, but this barnyard today is a nice green mowed lawn. You know, it obviously wasn't like that in 1863 because a lot of the animals were out in the barnyard. And up on top, in the top floor, he kept wheat, oat, corn, and then he had a corn crib. That's behind the tree. Wagon shed here where he stored his wagons in addition to the top floor. He had a threshing floor where they could knock the inedible part off the wheat and oat, and that would fly away in the wind. But those animals were really crammed in there, and he had bought a lot of wood to build a pig pen because of their smell and get them out of there. But he hadn't built it yet, and it was all just sitting there, and it got used by the Army.
I finished your book about 2 weeks ago. I can't recommend it any better than it's just wonderful. It's just a fantastic book. And I was so impressed with the appendix of the roster of those that were treated there. And I believe you said that that was a compilation from,
Yes.
from 2 sites and then your own work. My question is that kind of listing available for any of the other
Yes.
Corps and Division hospitals?
That's a great question because, and it was a frustrating thing to me, because there weren't any other Corps hospitals in Gettysburg. This was the only Corps one. The other ones were all broken up by division. But all of the other division hospitals have a register at the National Archives, and it lists what I list. It lists their name, their rank, their regiment, their wound, and how they were treated. I found a book with the help of a friend from Cleveland, which copies, it had men from various divisions and 11th Corps guys, but it didn't have Armistead, it didn't have Barlow, it didn't have Stowe. It wasn't complete. So I took as many guys out of that one as I could, cleaned up their names, and I found some other sources. But the 11th Corps register that they took, they did take it there. It was written down. You can ask for it at the archives and they'll go look for it and they say, oh, it's been lost. So yeah, that history is lost. So, but I got 1,400 names, so I'm not happy I don't have 1,900 names, but I got 1,400, and 26th Wisconsin is the most that I got. So maybe someday it will turn up. I have my fingers crossed.
Thank you, and congratulations on all the detail. I mean, that's really amazing.
Oh,
I didn't realize that Armitage had actually, I guess, been taken prisoner and died in a Union hospital.
He was there 3 days.
Yeah, but because of the carnage, though, were there any comments about, I mean, when you think about the days afterwards, I mean, all the horses and carnage and death and destruction, it must have been horrible. So.
On the farm in Gettysburg, I mean, there were so many dead and dying horses that were fouling the waterways. You know, they were lying in the waterways, pooping in the waterways. So these close hospitals, their water was all fouled. Even their well water was fouled. So they had to, basically didn't have any water. The smell of the burning of the horses, it's so awful. You got horses who are wounded. They're walking around on the battlefield on their knees, and the army is going around shooting them to take them out of their misery. And then they're burning them, and the citizens of Gettysburg are wearing masks because the smell is so horrific. Nurse Price, who was in this talk, talked about how all of the residents had to keep their windows closed because the smell was so foul. And you know, at the farm, like I talked about, at this farm with the infections, you can smell a nasty infection 8 to 10 feet away. So again, just imagine a tent with 8 to 10 guys in it. You just get an infection after a surgery in a Civil War, you just did. They expected it. And so the conditions, and then the piles of limbs that are as high as the forebay, man high and higher. But you know, one thing about those citizens of Gettysburg, as shocking as it was to them, after a while they got used to seeing dead bodies around and they just went on with their work.
I got one question. After the war and at the different reunions, were there veterans that went back to the Spangler farm?
Yes.
Just to see where they were wounded or where they, et cetera, et cetera?
They did. this. Richard Holland, Private Richard Holland of the 9th Massachusetts Battery. They had a bunch of guys come back to the farm in 1884, and they wanted to place their 3 monuments on the battlefield, the 3 places they fought. So what do? The 9th Massachusetts was in the Artillery Reserve, who's based at the George Spangler farm. So 2 or 3 guys in that battery are professional artists. And I have 4 drawings in my book that the 9th Massachusetts guys made in 1884, and this is one of them. Richard Holland did that one, which I use as the backdrop on all of them. He did this one, Richard Holland, 9th Massachusetts in 1884. He did that one of the schoolhouse. And he did one more that's very important to me. The cover of the book is a Richard Holland drawing, 1884. I don't know how often that happened, but I know of that case, and which meant a lot to me, obviously, because I gained so much out of that visit that they made. They left Spangler and followed their exact tracks to the Trosso farm where they fought. They walked it.
Ron, thank you very much, and on behalf of the Roundtable, we'll present you the Certificate of Honor by the order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to Ronald Kirkwood for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you. That's really thoughtful. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's beautiful.
But you're not done. On behalf of the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, which is through the good graces of a couple of sons of veterans of the Iron Brigade regiments, the custodian of the Iron Brigade Association formed by the veterans, it gives me great pleasure to give you a membership pin, signifying membership in the Iron Brigade Association.
Oh. I am going to wear this pin every day I'm at the farm this summer, and that's going to be 2-3 dozen times.
Oh, please do.